Hello, everybody, and welcome to this very special episode of the Dr. Keith Darrow podcast, where today we welcome renowned cognitive neuroscientist and audiologist, Hannah Glick, Ph.D. Hannah, welcome, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. Excited to be here today.
Yeah, no, look, I have been following your work for a very long time, and admittedly, I think I almost forgot that you were also an audiologist, because most of your work really is in the cognitive neuroscience realm. I know you're teaching at Colorado and you've got a lot on your plate and you're doing so much, but deep down, I guess like myself, deep down, you are an audiologist. And so what does that mean to you?
So the way I describe it to a lot of people is I'm a person-centered cognitive neuroscientist. So for me, the people aspect, the motivation for the research I do, it's all motivated by improving clinical outcomes for people with hearing loss. So I think that's where the audiology piece really ties in, is that is so central to the research questions I ask and the work that I do, because without that, what is the purpose? You know, sometimes I see researchers in neuroscience working on projects and they're doing these projects where they're asking these really small questions and small
or obscure
obscure, and spend 20, 30, 40 years of their life on that really focused aspect. And for me, I guess my work is motivated by bigger questions and the need to really have an impact on the lives of people. So I'm more interested in clinical questions, or questions that have some translational aspect. So
I certainly get that, and I have to say I feel like when you say that, even though I know you weren't, I don't think you were directing it at me, I feel like part of my career was spent doing that. While I was at MIT and researching at the Harvard Medical Labs, I was definitely very honed in, very focused. I look back now at some of the research projects, which were great and they were exciting, but some people might think of them as short-sighted and pretty obscure, looking at these tiny connections between different parts of the auditory brainstem. And I've definitely come to evolve over the last 5 to 10 years to take that base and bring it back to clinical translational research, because every day you and I wake up and there's 42 million people who need our help. And right. I feel like we're in a position to be able to do that, especially with the work you're doing every day. Now, are you working with Au.D students or in the cognitive neuroscience department? What's your position like?
So I work in the speech and hearing science department at the University of Colorado, Boulder. So I primarily work with undergraduate students and then graduate students in the Au.D program. I am involved in the cognitive science and the neuroscience institutes departments on campus as well, but not teaching those students so much, mostly focusing on training of students in audiology and speech and hearing sciences.
Okay. And you come from a background, as we said, with audiology and a triple Ph.D. I don't know what that means.
Everybody always wants to ask that question. So when I started college, it became really clear to me that I wanted a career where I could help people, but a career that was also kind of technically challenging as well. So I was drawn to science and the medical field for that reason. And I had a family friend that I grew up with who was born with hearing loss. And she was a big motivating factor. She got a cochlear implant as an adult. She was a big motivating factor for why I decided to go into audiology. And originally I was thinking I wanted to go the clinical route. But as I started in the Au.D program, I realized, why are we spending so much time focusing on the ear? Why aren't we spending more time talking about the brain? And that's where perception ultimately happens. There's so many other things at play when we are decoding sound and background noise. And so that just kind of set off a whole different career trajectory for me, where I decided to do my PhD. And the University of Colorado is really cool in that it has a combined program where you can specialize in neuroscience and cognitive science at the same time while you're working on your kind of primary PhD. So it was the perfect opportunity for me to learn about these other aspects, these other fields that tie so close into audiology that maybe audiologists don't focus on as much as they should. So
am I supposed to call you or refer to you as Dr. Glick? How does that work?
Just call me Hannah. That's what I tell my students. I'm not so into fancy titles and things like that. But
was it so? Did you graduate? Was it 3 different programs? Was it 3 different degrees? How does that work?
It's technically 3 different degrees.
Okay.
But a lot of the courses and the things count towards the other degrees. So it's an integrated combined program. I only did 1 dissertation. I wasn't doing 3 dissertations.
Oh, all right, good. You had me worried there.
Yeah. But it was great because I got input and insight from my committee members from these other disciplines as well, who got to serve as my mentors. So it was a really great opportunity for me to really do interdisciplinary research.
Yeah, which I think is probably the most important part of education, and unfortunately, one of the things that is most lacking. I felt as though I was fortunate enough to be raised in a scientific environment where I was the clinical audiologist. I sat next to a student who was a geneticist, a physicist, an engineer, and a biologist. And I feel like that was really what helped to shape my thought process on how it all comes together and how all these fields, they seem so separated, but truly, if you want to make an advance in a medical field, you've got to take that team approach and you need to look at it from every angle.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. And even back to some of the basic science we were talking about earlier in animal models versus human-based research, I think that the animal-based research is also really important. That's earlier stage, but that helps to inform some of the human research studies that we then do. So I don't see it as this is good and this is bad, but we can learn from each other. Just for me, the way my personality is and my strengths are, I like to work on this side, but that doesn't mean I can't learn from experts in different areas that are focusing on different kinds of things.
Certainly. So. You bring back the memory of when I was at the Massachusetts Eye and Ear. My research labs were on the 4th floor. And up on the 6th floor, I didn't exactly understand what they were doing, but there was a lot of genetics going on. I heard a rumor of stem cells. And then we all got called upstairs one day to come and see one of the first pictures of stem cells being grown in a mammalian, in the mouse inner ear. It was just fantastic. So cool. Everybody was sort of taken back. That goes back 20 years now. And now fast forward, there are studies being done in humans with stem cells. And although the results are, I don't know, debatable, worth discussion, it's still one of those steps that must be taken to eventually, dare I say, cure hearing loss. Mm-hmm. So let me ask you, before I get to your audiology program and best practices, because I want to get your take on that, but I want to ask you, what has your research been focused on? What is your, I guess, I'm sure you filed for an R01 or an R03. Like, what is your main research goal? What are you working towards in your career?
So my research has been focused on neuroplasticity and hearing loss across the human lifespan, and specifically looking at neuroplasticity before and after treatment and rehabilitation. So most of my projects have been done using high-density EEG, which is a non-invasive neuroimaging technique that allows us to look at neuroplasticity at the highest centers of the brain, at the level of the auditory cortex. And we've looked at neuroplasticity in all kinds of different populations. So looking at neuroplasticity and brain development in children with hearing loss before and after intervention, and in children with rarer forms of hearing loss like auditory neuropathy spectrum disorder, We've looked at adults with single-sided deafness before and after cochlear implantation, which is becoming a new opportunity for people with single-sided deafness to have some new treatment options. And then we've also focused on older adults with hearing loss, especially mild hearing loss, and the association between some of these brain changes that we see and things like cognitive function and social emotional well-being. So I would say that's how I would kind of summarize my work. But I tend to kind of sometimes focus in on different types of clinical populations.
I'm going to be completely selfish because I consider myself more of a specialist when it comes to adults. So while the child work is certainly very interesting and people can go and find that, I want to ask you specifically, what have you started to notice? What are some of the changes in cognitive function, in neuroplasticity that you have noticed in your older adults with, even though I hate the word, with mild hearing loss?
Yeah, we can debate that all day. What is mild? What is normal hearing? I'm with you on that. But one of the how this research first started started with adults is we were looking at something called cross-modal neuroplasticity. So what cross-modal neuroplasticity is when there's deprivation in one sensory modality. So for example, if there's hearing loss, there's deprivation to the auditory cortex. How do our other senses like vision and touch adapt? And if you look back at
so it's like that old adage, you lose one sense and the others are heightened, right? But that's sort of a common sense or non-scientific way of looking at it. Sounds like you're actually trying to quantify, does that happen? And if so, what do those changes look like?
Exactly. And so we've known for a long time in animal models that when there's deafness, we see cross-modal neuroplasticity happen. And we see that these brain changes where neurons in the auditory cortex are actually responding to visual stimulation, we see that that's actually correlated with heightened visual perception. So cats with deafness, for example, they'll actually pay more attention to visual stimuli in their periphery when they are deaf. And there's also been studies in adults with deafness showing the same thing.
Sure.
So one of the questions we had is, what about early stage hearing loss? Do we see cross-modal plasticity? That study had never been done before when we did it. And is it related to functional dependence on vision? So that was my dissertation study. And interestingly, we do see cross-modal neuroplasticity, but at least in the early stages of hearing loss, there isn't enhanced visual performance. So people with early stage hearing loss, they're not better lip readers than people with normal hearing.
Sure.
So this was interesting because it tells us that a lot of these brain changes that we are seeing, at least in the early stages of hearing loss, they're more likely driven by deprivation to the auditory cortex itself rather than, heightened dependence on vision. Some people might say, well, that's a good thing. If you're depending more on vision and lip reading, it helps you perform better. But that's not true, at least in hearing loss's early stages. So that's one example of some of the work that we've done. Another thing that we looked at.
I want to ask you something there though. So, right, I know scientists hate this question, but why?
Yeah.
Why do you think that change is not happening early on? See, when you talk about it, I instantly think, well, it sounds like the brain is trying to hold on for dear life to the sense of audition, to that ability to hear. It's willing to go into cognitive overload. It's willing to work harder before abandoning and filling in the missing pieces with lip reading. That makes sense. Is that a plausible theory?
Yes. So what we think is happening instead is Yes, there is this cross-modal reorganization happening. It's largely driven by just deprivation to the auditory cortex. But instead of relying extra on vision to perform better, instead, what adults with early stage hearing loss are doing is they're recruiting additional brain networks to process auditory information. They're recruiting areas of the prefrontal cortex and the frontal cortex. They're using executive function to help try to parse that speech signal, especially when they're in difficult listening environments like background noise. So there's different things at play here, and the changes that we see in the brain are different depending on whether hearing loss just begun, some of the compensations that happen, versus whether the person has had their hearing loss for 10, 15, 20 years, and it's severe to profound. So, yeah, to your point, I think that's exactly what's happening.
And I think that's interesting because that reinforces, and I don't think now I want to, we'll stop geeking out for a second and talk about the clinical audiologist. Like, I think that's part of the lack of knowledge. Part of the reason why I several months ago, and now we're doing it every year, our neuroscience boot camp. And I would love to have you come to next year's and speak on this topic, because I don't think enough clinical audiologists, the day-to-day, I mean, the people that are on the front grounds, sort of treating those patients that are suffering with hearing loss, I don't know that they appreciate and really understand how much is involved in hearing. Look, I remember my graduate courses, it was just the ear up to primary auditory cortex. We studied everything in between, but it's like we were almost taught that it stops here.
Yeah.
And that's not remotely true. What we know from neuroscience is everything is interconnected. And so it makes perfect sense to me that somebody would rely on other parts of the brain to help with hearing as you start to lose it.
Yeah, and I think tying back to clinical implications, that's one of the reasons why we need to assess speech perception and noise in adults, because we're through doing those types of assessments and tests, we are looking at higher levels of auditory processing involving things like cognition and executive functioning. We need to be measuring that clinically. And I think it's sad looking at some of the statistics. A lot of audiologists, they'll do their pure tone testing, they'll do speech testing in quiet, but not all audiologists are doing that speech testing in noise. And then I think we can also think about things like cognitive screening and the role that plays in audiology as well.
So you brought me right to my next topic of best practices. And I don't mean to put you in a position where somehow Hannah represents all universities and the entire AUD education system. But I would like your insight on what's the problem, right? What is going on? Where is the breakdown? Because you're right. We need to be doing speech and noise testing. We need to be doing real ear verification. We need to be doing cognitive screening. So I just picked 3.
Mm-hmm.
Yet on average, or I should say the average audiologist is not doing them. So, and dare I say, with my preliminary research, and I have a study that I'm starting to work on and recruiting students for, with the little observations I've made, these things aren't necessarily being driven home at the AUD education system. It's almost like the problem is starting at the beginning. Maybe it's talked about, but if you look at some of the on-site clinics, they're not doing cognitive screenings. Some of them are, from time to time, opting not to do speech and noise testing. Some of them are telling patients with tinnitus and mild hearing loss, you're not ready for treatment, just go and get a noisemaker. Like, I feel like I'm convinced, and my study will hopefully prove me right or wrong, that it's really starting at the education system. So I would love your thoughts on this and what it's like at your program.
Yeah, so I think that we've got 2 problems. One, we've got to update and innovate AUD curriculum and education, and I'm totally with you there. But I think the other problem is when students start their clinical rotations off-site at other practices and clinics, I think because we have practicing audiologists out there who are not necessarily following best practices, or doing some of these new things in audiology, like cognitive screening, students are also not getting exposure to that either. And then, so I think we've got kind of two problems going on.
Yeah.
But where can we solve things? I think things like the work that you're doing with clinical audiologists, that's one way to address practicing audiologists out in the field, learning about the connection between hearing loss and the brain. And then the other piece we need to address is innovating AUD curriculum and education.
I really am. I'm so glad to hear you say that. Sometimes I feel like I'm in a silo by myself, screaming and nobody's listening. But I certainly appreciate, and I think you're right with both angles, because I'm so obsessed with figuring out what's happening at step one.
Yep.
And so let's figure that out. But you are 100% right. The next problem, once even if we innovate and we completely fix the AUD system, which is great. So I'm not knocking it. I know that they teach the core principles.
Mm-hmm.
But even if we nail that down, I think you're 100% right. Once they get into their clinical practicums, this is where the bad habits really get reinforced.
Yep.
And next thing you know, you have somebody who goes to a fourth year that doesn't do cognitive screenings, doesn't do real verification. What do you think they're going to do for the rest of their life when they go work somewhere, when they go open a clinic? They too are going to be deficient and take shortcuts. And so I think you're 100% right there, that it's a double-edged sword or a double whammy.
Yeah. For example, last year, we have an aging course that we teach to second and third year AUD students, where they learn all about cognitive screening. They learn about cognitive assessment. They meet neuropsychologists and learn about the work that they do and how that ties into audiology. And they become certified in administering cognitive screenings and really learn how to use the equipment or administer things like the MOCA, the MMSE, and they have options. So they are not tied. I have to use this cognitive screening tool. They get exposure to all of those so they can decide what makes sense for them. But then I see those students going out into their clinical rotations and they say, well, the audiologist, my clinical supervisor, they don't do cognitive screening. And so it's exactly what you said. I think that in a lot of AUD programs, that education is not happening in the first place. But then we've got the clinical side as well. So we've got to attack it from both sides.
I love that. And I would encourage, if any student listens to this, please go to the University of Colorado at Boulder, because that is the level of education that you need. Whereas I have I call them my little moles around the country in different AUD programs, because they leave my undergrad and then go out there, and I stay in touch with a lot of them. And I'll ask them, 3 or 4 years in, hey, what have you learned so far about the correlations of hearing loss and dementia? And the vast majority say, oh, yeah, we read that paper from Frank Lin that came out of Johns Hopkins. Okay, what else do you know? Well, that was really it. They told us to read this, and then, it's not really in our scope of practice. And I'm just like, oh my gosh.
Yeah. So that applied piece is really important. Yes. And I think too, like when we think about things like cognitive screening, I think that there's the skills piece where students, practicing audiologists, they're like, okay, well, I can do the cognitive screening, but how do I tie that in to my practice, to the work that I'm doing? And so it's not just about the knowledge about cognitive screening and why it's related to hearing. It's how is this relevant to me? So how can I use this as a counseling tool? How can I actually use this data in my practice to learn more about my patients and how to better serve my patients?
Yeah, we all scream that we're evidence-based.
Yeah.
So you're exactly right. Like, there's lots of tools. And look, in full transparency, both you and I are on the CogniView audiology board, right? But I appreciate what you said, and I agree 100%. There are many options for cognitive screening. Do I think the computerized test that CogniView's developed is really easy and great to use? Yes, But that's okay. If that doesn't work for you, there are other options. We were doing paper-based screenings well before the technology ever came out. And I think you're right that we have to help people understand how to integrate it into the diagnostic process, even though it's just a screening. But how do we talk to our patients about it? How do we integrate it into the rehabilitative process, right? I'm sure you would agree that there are the rehabilitation plan is different for somebody who's has cognitive impairment or showing signs of issues with memory loss and executive function as compared to somebody who scores 100% on all of these different memory or screening tests. And so we have to be able to incorporate that.
Yeah, I'm 100% in agreement with that.
So
I think another piece kind of tying into clinical education, and something that has, through my professional experience, has become really important to me is I think there's this limiting belief sometimes amongst audiologists that the only option as an audiologist is to be a clinical audiologist. And in thinking about AUD education, I think it's really important to expose students to all of the options that they have available to them as a clinical audiologist. For example, being involved as a research audiologist. That research training is really important, and there's a great need, whether it's in industry or academia, for research audiologists. There's a lot of opportunities on the rehabilitation side of audiology where a lot of audiologists aren't practicing. They're focused mainly on diagnostics on that rehabilitative side. I think there's a lot of opportunities. And so as kind of an aside, I've seen a lot of AUD students who start to question in their second year, third year. It's not that they don't love clinic or working with patients, but they have other skills and other strengths, but they don't necessarily know how to use them or how to connect with other people in the field that are maybe doing clinical work, but also doing other work as well. And so I think that is also really important. It's just like a PhD. My advisor said, a doctor of philosophy, it's not something specific. I'm trained in this. You're trained to learn how to think and how to solve problems and how to approach problems. And I think we need to reframe clinical education and audiology as well. Teaching students they can use these skills in different ways.
So I completely agree. With that said, right, and we're gonna start to wrap it up here. I want to know, because a lot of people are like, what's audiology going to look like in 5 to 10 years? There's been this overwhelming, unnecessary fear of over-the-counter, direct-to-consumer, right? What's going to happen? None of us are going to have jobs. I mean, just utter craziness. Meanwhile, there's still 42 million people sitting on the sidelines living without treatment. And I did the math at some point, but if 10% of them opted for help tomorrow, we would all have a wait list of 6 years or something crazy like that, right? So what do you see? Is glass half full, glass half empty? What do you think about hearing healthcare and audiology in the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of doom and gloom out there about the future of audiology, especially OTCs threatening practice. I have students all the time asking me about how that's going to affect the future of their profession, and they're worried about it. And I guess for me, I don't feel worried about it. Like you, I see the opportunity. There's so many people out there that have got hearing loss, early stages of hearing loss, or just difficulty listening, even if they've got quote unquote normal hearing. There's a lot of opportunities for audiologists to make a difference. So I guess my vision, I can tell you what I'd like to see. I'd love to see audiology. There's this trend towards specialization in audiology. So audiologists specializing in vestibular, intraoperative monitoring, those kinds of things. I think that's a great opportunity for audiologists to make a difference. But I'd also love to see, for the longest time, we've been focused on diagnostics and treatment with technology. And I'd love to see audiology return back to its rehabilitative roots. And this is where the brain ties in. And so that's kind of what I see as the two frontiers coming up in audiology. So
excellent. I love your vision, and cheers to making it come true, because that's exactly what I think this healthcare this field of healthcare needs. I think we need that optimism. I think we need that drive to really help us understand our inherent value. I think we've been beaten down by the big five for long enough and told that our value is in the widget, and it's just not true at all, right? I mean, it's a tiny piece of what we do. And I think that over the counter is going to prove that. It already has with Bose, in that people don't want a product. They don't want a retail transaction. They want to address their progressive degenerative hearing loss that puts them at risk for all sorts of bad things, including cognitive decline, falls, and even, loss of life. So Dr. Glick, Hannah, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your insights. I know people are going to love this. Just so you know, I just got notice this morning that we had our 1,000th download of our podcast. So I know awesome. People are going to hear this, and I know people are really going to appreciate your insight. Thank you for all you do.
Thanks so much for having me, Keith.
Absolutely. So, hey, let me ask you though, one personal question. Everybody gets a really personal question at the end. What's your favorite movie?
My favorite movie. You know what I love? I love When Harry Met Sally. I'm going for a rom-com here. It's a classic.
You're a rom-com sap. Okay. Now we all know a little bit more about you.
An old rom-com sap, because they're classics. The new ones just don't cut it.
Yeah. So you mean not the J-Lo ones, but more the Meg Ryan ones.
Yeah. I like a good, I like a good feel-good movie. I also love sci-fi. Interstellar. I love that stuff.
Yes. So. Yes, I'm with you. I'm with you on that. All right, Hannah, thank you so much, and have a great day.
All right. Bye, Keith.